Hi, everybody. This is Ann Patchett at Parnassus Books. Thank you for listening to Parnassus Presents. Your support allows us to keep bringing you fantastic events. So please consider purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book at the link below. We hope you enjoy the event, recorded live from the Parnassus stage. I'm Ann Patchett, and you're in Parnassus Books, and we are so excited to have you here and to have Joe Kanon here. And I'm going to tell you, turn your phones off. You know that, but right, I'll tell you anyway. We're really just grateful that you're shopping local and that you're showing up for this wonderful event on a rainy night, because we're excited about the rain and we're excited about the author. So this is my connection. When I was 25 years old, I sold my first novel, The Patron Saint of Liars, to Houghton Mifflin, and Joe Kanon was the editor-in-chief. So you were the guy who agreed to give me that enormous amount of money, and I've been grateful ever since. But the last time I saw Joe, I was 25. And I'm 60, so it's been a while. And I'm really glad to see you again.
Worth every penny.
Yeah, right? Because one day I would grow up and get a bookstore and invite you to come back. Actually, you've been here a couple of times, and I've always been out of town when you were here. Anyway, as you know, Joe is the author. This is number 11, Shanghai, winner of the Edgar Prize. You're going to tell us about George Clooney at some point and all the things we want to know, research your life. I'm so glad you're here. Come talk to him. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for coming out in the rain. Whenever one comes to a bookstore to do these events, I find that the question that's most frequently asked and anticipated now by me is, where did you get the idea? Why this book? I mean, often it's code for, is this autobiographical? Because people now are conflating diaries with novels and not really understanding that there's a great difference between them. And not understanding really that all novels are autobiographical in the sense that they're drawing on everything you know, and even just choice of word is something that's unique to you and not someone else. So I think it's one of those meaningless debates about what constitutes this kind of autofiction or real fiction. But I obviously don't write autofiction. I was not alive in 1939 on a boat going to Shanghai. It's not a memoir in any way, in any sense. So why do you do them? Where do these ideas come from? I find that for me, and any of you who are familiar with any of the work will recognize this, it usually begins with place. What will happen is that I will be somewhere that begins to interest me more than it probably should, and I get really interested and want to know more, and before you know it, it's being peopled with characters in my head, and off you go. Often this is a year or two of doing research because it's something that you don't want to get wrong. You don't want people sending emails pointing out that you have, the wrong gun being used or something like that, which they delight in doing. But it's typical to start with the place, and it was certainly typical of this book. I went to Shanghai in the year before the pandemic. We can now measure things by before and after, and it was that year. And as a tourist, and like every other tourist who goes to Shanghai, I was dazzled by the infrastructure, the new tall cities that go up seemingly overnight, but actually in about 10 years. But still, really impressive. And the soup dumplings and the wonderful restaurants and the old French concession with the plane tree avenues and the villas. I experienced the Shanghai that any of you who have been would have experienced, including walking along the Bund, which is the riverfront, and seeing that it was once this dream of the West. It's filled with old classical banks and trading companies and Art Deco hotels and things of that sort. And I thought, this was China. at a certain point, or it was in any case their notion of what they wanted China to be. I was intrigued, but aside from those tourist things, I was much taken by a kind of almost a footnote in a guidebook that said that if you go to Hangzhou, to that district, you could see some buildings that had been restored that had been the center of the Jewish community in the late 30s when people who escaped Hitler had settled in Shanghai. And I thought, really? Had settled in Shanghai? Who knew? I hadn't heard about this. There had been Jews in Shanghai for years, and many of them were wealthy traders and famous, like the Sassoons and the Harduns and the Karduris, and they had been part of the great growth of this town into a major metropolitan city. But this was a different wave of immigration altogether. This was a wave of salvation for people who were really threatened with death. And I thought, how interesting, and what's out there? And it's walkable from Central City, so I walked and went to see it. What had been the synagogue is now a museum and filled with really interesting photographs of that period and the people. There's a kind of coffee shop which is meant to duplicate the sort of Viennese coffee shops that people had set up there, and you can see the photographs where all the signs are in German or Yiddish. Chusan Road was then called Little Vienna, and you had this community of Central European, mostly German and Austrian, Jewish refugees. I was fascinated. I thought, why here? Why would they come halfway around the world to settle in Shanghai? Not for the soup dumplings. There had to be some real reason. And of course, the obvious reason is that there was nowhere else to go. What was behind this kind of tsunami invasion, and it only happened, it's a short period of time, it's fewer months than a year altogether, but between 18 and 20,000 people came at that time. The reason being, of course, that no one else would take them. Let's just do a 1-minute detour in the context of this, the historical context. After November 38, Kristallnacht, when the Nazis unleashed the pogrom across all of central Germany, it became perfectly clear that this wasn't just going to be a discriminatory anti-Semitic state. This was going to be a fatally murderous one. And you had to get out and save your life. You just needed now to get out. It wasn't a question of if, when, or but, or whatever question you were using to put yourself in a state of denial up until now. You really had to do it. The problem, and you could leave if you surrendered all of your assets, but the problem was no one would take you. And doors were going up all across the world. Lines were forming at the consulates in Berlin for people applying for visas that were on waiting lists that were years long. If you wanted to come to America, I think the wait list was something like 5 or 6 years, or in any case, an unconscionably long time. The State Department in those days was famously old boy, waspy, anti-Semitic, and went out of their ways to make it difficult for anybody to immigrate of this sort. But rumors then swept through the community, even as they were standing in line at these consulates, that in fact you could go to Shanghai. No landing papers were required, no visa. If you could get out, if you could afford to get on one of the ocean liners, usually on the Lloyd line that was going to the Orient, if you could afford that and give up everything else, you could get in, you would be taken, and you could save your life. Some 20,000, as I say, did. Shanghai is the story of one of those boats and the people that were on it, people who were on it, and what happened to them in going to Shanghai. Whether they saved themselves and found a refuge, but they found a great deal else. And what I hope is that you're all going to find a kind of entertaining story in this. We have our protagonist who is escaping by the skin of his teeth. He'd been involved in the political resistance. They'd been rolled up. Everyone he had worked with had been tortured and murdered, and so far he has escaped. Nobody has given him up, and he is about to leave. He can get on this boat and create a new life for himself and put everything behind him. He's very lucky. He falls in love with a woman who is traveling with her mother and whose lives have been completely impoverished and destroyed by the Nazis, and she is looking with a kind of gimlet eye at what's awaiting them, and she's not so much looking forward to a new life as just doing anything she needs to do to stay alive and survive. There happens to be a Japanese military figure who is a military figure in the Kempeitai, which is their Gestapo figure, and we get from him a sense of what is about to happen in Asia. And there are several other people on board, and there's nothing more tedious, I think, than describing a plot you haven't already read, so we're not going to describe the plot. But suffice it to say that what we're doing is following these people on this 2 to 3 week trip, and they arrive penniless. You're allowed to take 10 Reichsmarks with you, which is about $7 or $8 at this point, maybe even less. All of your assets have been swept away. Wow, that sounds really terrific. So far I haven't made a mistake, so the skies have opened up anyway. It doesn't matter. Just as I always feared they would, Anyway, they are penniless, they are stateless, they are without visible working skills in a society in which there are people willing to do anything for any money whatsoever. They don't have the language. They don't even have an alphabet. They arrive and they see that the signs are all in ideograms, and it's like being on the moon. It just couldn't be more exotic. Nevertheless, they did come and they are welcomed. How did this happen? Why did they slip through this historical loophole? And what did it really, what was the mechanism by which they were able to take advantage of this? Again, if any of you are familiar with this background, you can zone out for about a minute or two while I just do the context. It's not a history lesson, but it's as well that we know where this all comes from. Essentially, 100 years before this, Britain was buying all the tea in China and quite a lot of porcelain and silk too, and wasn't selling anything in return. They had a real balance of payment problem, and they solved it by deciding to set up an opium trade, thus making a triangle out of Afghanistan, where the poppies were grown, to India, their colony, where it would be processed, and then to China, where they would sell it to a vast ready market, or a market that could be created. Naturally, the Chinese government was against this. In fact, they were against Western traders in toto, but they certainly didn't want anybody who was trying to enslave the population. So they said no. Gunboats were sent out, the so-called Opium Wars took place, and after 1842, the failing Qing dynasty had agreed, and were forced to agree, to set up 5 so-called treaty ports, and they were trading concessions. Foreigners were allowed to live on this land and do business and trade. The land technically still belonged to China, so that China had sovereignty over its own land. But in practice, it was administered by the Shanghai Municipal Council, who were Western businessmen. And in practice, it meant that this was a de facto colony. Now, that in itself created a situation that gave Shanghai an early reputation for being fast and loose with the law. It turns out that they were granted something called extraterritoriality or extrality, which meant that even though they were, quote, living in China, they were not susceptible to any of the Chinese laws, and they could only be tried in the courts of their home nations, which essentially meant that they weren't tried at all, and essentially meant that nobody was paying any attention to these laws. You could escape the cops in one concession simply by walking across the street to another concession where you would be subject to a different body of lawmakers. So what was decided is that the Brits and the Americans and about 8 or 9 others who had been granted these concessions would bind together to form the International Settlement, which is today's central Shanghai. The French elected not to do this. They just kept their own concession going, and it is even today on maps called the French concession, and it now remains still the chicest and most desirable place in Shanghai to live. But what was predicted happened. The Qing dynasty tottered. China went into greater chaos. The opium trade was immensely successful. Many fortunes were made. A lot of people got hooked, and a lot of people became troubled as a result of all of this. As China went further into chaos, Shanghai grew and grew and grew. By the 1920s, it was the 5th largest city in the world, and it had started from nothing but a fishing village on mudflats. Now it was filled with the bund that I was describing earlier, the banks and the trading companies and all of the appurtenances of the West. I thought, imagine being one of the people on these boats getting off. You've been at sea for 3 weeks. You've got no money. You have no idea what your future is. Some people are deciding they can reinvent themselves. Some people are just distraught. What do you see? And what they see is this almost astounding port of the Bund with all the activity going on, but it looked like something from the West, except there were coolies, as they were then called, pulling rickshaws, and people in costumes that made them look like this was a stage set for some sort of play. Now, you can delight in that, but in fact, after they got over the reassurance of seeing Western buildings, what was happening to most people coming off these boats is that they were being loaded onto the backs of trucks by the local charities who had taken responsibility for them. And they were being taken to something called Heime, which is German for home, and they were barrack-like dormitories where you would be provided with food and a place to sleep, and often sanitation facilities that consisted of a pail at the end of the hall, so that for people who had just come from grand villas on the Ringstrasse, this was a shock. It was a bewildering kind of setback. And I was taken by the photographs of the people, and that half of them looked bewildered and half of them looked frightened. And some of these photographs looked eerily similar to photographs of people being loaded onto flatbed trucks or railway cars during the Holocaust, which was about to happen. Nevertheless, these people had escaped. They were alive. And what did they find? They found not only their freedom, but they found this extraordinary city that, because of its background and reputation, was almost utterly lawless. I mean, Shanghai at this point had become a byword for vice. Behind these wonderfully impressive insurance buildings and banks were alleyways filled with brothels and opium dens and gambling clubs. Our hero who has escaped, our protagonist who has escaped Germany, has an uncle who's working in the nightclub business there, so he's doubly lucky. He's actually got some work waiting for him. He can get a job. And he is going to enter into this world of nightlife. The Shanghai nightlife is legendary at this point. It's the most vibrant in Asia, and it can only be compared to something like Weimar Berlin or Chicago in the 20s, during the Capone 20s. It's violent. There's a lot going on, and people are out every night. There are sailors off the ships with their pockets full of money who are looking for a good time, and they find it. There are bachelors working at Jardine Matheson and making lots more money than they ever anticipated, and they've got their pockets full of money, and they're looking for a good time, and they find it. There is something for everybody in Shanghai. Ciro's out on Bubbling Well Road is an Art Deco modern masterpiece. It's like something out of a Hollywood movie, which isn't surprising because it's copied from a Hollywood movie. There's a kind of feedback loop here that goes. If you go to the Cathay Hotel, you can go to the very smart Tower Suite room where you can dance like Fred and Ginger, or you can go out to the dog track where there's a ballroom that might be featuring the Manila Rhythm Boys. And Joe Fenner, who was an exhibition dancer from Vienna, who's now the Ziegfeld of Shanghai, has his chorus girls are called the Paramount Peaches. And a new show will be put on every few weeks there. There's something always going on. And it so happens that our characters who get off the boat and find themselves involved, engrossed in this city, have come at a time when things are about to intensify and become even more violent and more corrupted. This is because the western edge of the international settlement had never really been seriously surveyed, and nobody was quite sure where the borders were because nobody cared. You wanted to live near the river, and you didn't need to live out there in the countryside. But now the city has grown, and things have developed there, and the Japanese, having started a war with China in 1937, have taken over all of central and China and the south coast. And they want to encourage this because they want to encourage the building of more casinos and more bars and more nightclubs because there's more graft to be had. It was called squeeze in Shanghai. You would take a little bit here and a little bit there. The Japanese, being the last group to come in, were getting the last bit of it, so they wanted more and encouraged the growth of nightlife, even as it became perfectly clear that having won the war with China, they were about to take over Shanghai too. They stopped short at the international settlement. Part of the city was in fact shelled and bombed during their invasion. There are stories of Western expats in rooftop bars who were watching the shelling as if they were fireworks and having drinks, etc. But the Japanese were not ready to take on the British Empire or the Americans at this point. This is 1939. We haven't yet opened World War II, and they're not going to do it. So they come right up to the street where China ends and the international settlement begins. And Shanghai, central Shanghai, becomes even more this island in the middle of chaos and this refuge for people. It was a peculiar kind of vice. I mean, I don't want to go on and on about the nightclubs, although I have to confess that was far and away the most interesting part of researching this book. And you would see one photograph after another of all these Koreans on boats, who were traveling over and going through their routines and their rehearsals, and it was just great. It was really fun. What wasn't fun at the time, though, is that this nightlife had a political overtone. It is often said that crime and politics are just flip sides of the same coin, and usually it's said in a cynical way. But in Shanghai, it was not only true, but they had taken it to a whole other level of involvement. We were getting criminal politics, and this was what was confronting our protagonists who have got off the boat and are trying to make their way through this thicket of moral quandaries and traps, etc., etc. The most famous example of this, of crime and politics overlapping, was Chiang Kai-shek, when he was still running the national government in 1927, went to Big-eared Du, I'm not making the name up, who ran the Green Gang, and they controlled the opium trade. And Chiang said to Du, I've got a problem with the communists. We've got a civil war. I want somebody to take care of them. And if you can do this for me, I'll stay out of the opium trade. You've got a free hand there. Du took him at his word, and it is estimated that something like 10,000 communists were killed and murdered by this violent gang with, I guess, guns and whatever else was to hand. This broke the back of the Chinese resistance in Shanghai and started the Long March to Yan'an. But it was not the only, it's the most dramatic example, but it's not the only example of this. We now have people who are going to have to make some decisions, and particularly our protagonist, who has a political association with a lot of these people. And we're now in 1939, where everything personal becomes political. Everyone is fighting for some measure of safety in their lives. And what he wants to know, and the dilemmas that confront them, are ultimately end in murder. And the question of, when is murder ever justified? Is it ever justified? Who would say so? When is it an acceptable political act? When is it an acceptable personal act, or some mixture of the two? Shanghai, this book, is about a time when these various these forces I've just been going through, the desperation of the refugees, the seductive and yet corrupt nightlife that has turned this city into something really criminal-oriented. And this is now confused with what's happening politically in a country whose politics and whose military activity for the next few years are going to constitute the hinge of that century. Things that are really going to be with us 50 years later, 100 years, are happening then, and they're all happening as Shanghai is turned into what I think of as a moral minefield. How far do you go? What line do you cross? I think that this is a book about people making moral decisions, what it costs them, and maybe it's one of those books that, aside from being entertaining, which I hope, will also raise some questions for you to think about what we would do in the same situation and how we would fare with our own sense of ethical standards. I don't mean to make it sound unfun. I'm hoping that it's actually suspenseful and you'll really enjoy the characters. But I think that when we write these books, we're also writing them to explore these kind of moral issues. What do you do when there's no right thing to do? Just the least harmful, or the less bad thing, or these nuanced kind of phrases that describe what I think of as daily life and the kind of moral questions that we're faced with all the time. This is those questions put into a very heightened, dramatic format. I think once you get on the boat in Trieste, you will want to follow these people to a conclusion, but I leave it to you to tell me whether the conclusion was satisfactory in the end. Now I will stop nattering on and in fact turn it to any kind of question that is what you would really like to know, as opposed to this history lesson that I've been telling you. Anyway, any questions? Yeah.
Did you find that others had written about Shanghai, and did you base anything on their research or books or anything? Or did you do it all on your own in what you found in that museum?
No. There's a significant literature, which is, when I say research, I often mean books only and just the bibliography. When you go to a place, I call that location scouting. It's for this movie that's in your mind. You want to know where the characters lived. Was the apartment, could he walk to work? Were there trams? Just the sort of things of daily life that I think are important. Whether they feature in the book or not, it's important for the writer to know them. So when he writes about somebody walking down the street, he sees what that person would see. That's one form of research, but the other kind that I do a lot of is just library research, books. What's most valuable, there is not a lot of significant fiction about this, mercifully, because that would discourage one, and that would be the last thing I would want, is to compete on that level. But there certainly are memoirs of that time and books that are about the last days of Shanghai. This was one of those last hurrah situations where one of the phrases that's used is that these people were dancing on the lip of a volcano. The Japanese are about I mean, after Pearl Harbor, we have a very different situation in Shanghai. So this is that period leading up to Pearl Harbor. A lot of people understood that what was going on there was important. And it was also the center for most of the Western press. If they were going to have an Asian correspondent, more than likely it would be out of Shanghai. So there was a lot of stuff that you could read. And I did. I think photographs and maps are great. You know, all those kinds of things that may sound low tech, but I don't go on Google to get this. You know, I think it's much more interesting to go through the other books. Yeah.
How long do you spend on research? How long do you spend writing? Do you have a difficult time transitioning from research to writing? And do you read Jane Gardam?
I research for about a year, and then it takes about a year to write. I mean, you know, more or less. I mean, it depends. You can get off schedule. It is always a wrench to actually start the writing because then you give up the fun part, which is the research. I mean, I think it's, you know, in some peculiar way, I think some of us remain perennial students. And I find there's almost nothing more interesting than learning more about something that intrigued you to begin with, you know, and you say, oh, I want to know that. There's this little detail in a book about, in a memoir about someone who would live in Shanghai in 1938 and give parties, and I thought, oh, I want to know about all that. It's very interesting. So it's a year. Do I transition? Yeah, you transition because you've got to get on with it at some point. I mean, there's no other way to write a book than to write a book. And if that's what you want to do with the material, that's what you should be doing. I would give up if I didn't, I mean, I wouldn't do it if I felt that it didn't intrigue me enough to actually want to take that year out of your life where you live there in your head, which is why I think the place is so important in writing this. You're not just living with these people on the page, you're living in that place. And I haven't read Jane Gardam, but I should.
Old Phil.
Okay,
Failed in London, try Hong Kong.
great. Okay. This is how we do business here in America as opposed to Shanghai. Yeah.
I believe you said earlier that some of these families stayed there after the war. And what is the history of that? Are they incorporated into Shanghai life today, like immigrants, you know, who came from Germany in the 30s to the U.S., you know, now very successful,
Right.
You know, lawyers, professors, writers, etc. So
Right.
is that
No,
happened?
it was a very different situation. The families that I'd referred to earlier about having been in Shanghai for a long time had been there since the 1890s or something. And they were in real estate and indeed in opium. I mean, you know, they may have become very grand and knighted, and Sir Victor Sassoon was, you know, a grand man about town, but a lot of that money had come from the opium trade and then was invested in Shanghai real estate, which of course after 49 and the communists took over was worthless. But that's another story. As for the people who came in 38, 39, almost none of them stayed in Shanghai. They intended to move on to America or Australia or another more congenial landing spot for them, and they mostly did. There were some, I don't mean to suggest, by the way, that the people who came on these boats became criminals or in any way crooks, because by far the vast majority of them were people who managed to eke out a decent existence and survive the war. They had families, they had soccer teams, you know, there were synagogues that were functioning for them, etc. They had a family life. And some of them went on to become distinguished. I mean, Secretary Blumenthal, who was in, I think, the Obama administration, had been a child there. There was recently a thing in New York where an oratorio, a piece of music had been created about this phenomenon of Holocaust refugees coming to Shanghai. But and they wanted to find people to talk about it, but in fact, given the chronology, that people would be very long in the tooth unless they were very young children then, at the time, so it was hard to find anybody who could speak directly. It's interesting also to think, I mean, the world acts in very peculiar ways. These people who had arrived in Shanghai without any hope of a future, except what might be made by them, ended up okay. The Japanese had always had a very odd attitude about Jewish immigration. First of all, Hitler's race laws didn't play very well in Japan, where in fact they themselves had been the victims of discrimination in the West. And when he decided that the Japanese should be called honorary Aryans, this was not exactly what they wanted to hear. So they had very mixed feelings about this, and whenever the Nazis would push, you need to do something about your problem, the Japanese would push back a little. It's also true that after Pearl Harbor, if you were an enemy alien, that is to say, if you were an American or you were British, you were put into a camp by the Japanese, into the equivalent of their concentration camps. But this particular cohort of Jewish refugees were not enemy aliens because they weren't anything. They didn't have a passport. I mean, if they were going to be considered any nationality, it would have been German, which would have made them an Axis ally. So, in fact, what happened to them is that the Japanese, to their discredit, because they were being pressured on doing this, set up the neighborhood where most of the Jews had settled became a ghetto, and it was fenced off, and you had to go through security points back and forth if you were working in the rest of Shanghai. But we're not talking on a level of the Warsaw Ghetto or one of these pressure cooker places that's really just the first step to annihilation. It wasn't like that at all. I'm not suggesting it by any means that it was a bowl of cherries. It wasn't. Life was tough. There was a war on, but they survived it. They really came through, and in some peculiar way survived it in a better fashion than the expatriates who had been living there before. So, go figure. I mean, that was not something that was indicated. Yes.
I want to move into more of the operational or the business side of books.
Okay.
I love reading books and using my mind and my imagination to come up with their voices and the descriptions that are given by the author and what they must look like. But I do also have discovered audiobooks because it's a way to fill downtime at the gym or weeding the yard. Does the author have input into the audiobook? Like, who reads it? Do you approve it? Or once the publishing house, do they sell it to someone else?
The short answer to that is yes, they do have influence in this, if the contract so provides. I mean, it can go either way. I personally do. I mean, I have to approve the person who's reading the audiobook. I mean, I imagine if I were just being stupid about it, the publisher would call and say, oh, get off your horse, and we're going to the recording studio. We don't have time to listen to this nonsense. And I wouldn't have a lot of, it wouldn't be the be-all and end-all. Mm-hmm. But in fact, what happens is that if there's a slate of people who might be doing this, in Shanghai, for instance, the way it worked is that they sent me 4 or 5 tapes of people reading and saying, which one do you prefer? Mm-hmm. So you do have some input in there. I mean, we were listening in our house to Anne's book in audio, and Meryl Streep was reading it, and it doesn't get better than that. So it's fun. So some people have a lot of influence, or at least a lot of adversion.
Hi. When Anne introduced you, I didn't realize that you were an editor. So were you an editor first and then a writer, or how did you be,
Well, now that's all a long time ago, but I worked in publishing all my life from the time that I was in college on, and I was an editor and then a publisher, and then ultimately I was running the company, which meant, you were probably in way over your head, but I was having to do things like the budgets and the warehouse and that sort of thing as well. But the people that I had worked with as an editor, I kept working with, because it's a wonderfully intimate relationship, and I think a unique one. If you have an editor and a writer who get each other and who really trust each other in doing this, it's one of those things you don't want to replace, and you hang on to it. So I made sure that I kept some of that going and could work with people that I'd worked with before. But essentially, you move into the management part of it, the administrative part of it. So when I finally left, but I know what you're asking. I loved publishing. I had a great time in it. I was not looking to leave the industry by any means. I did not have manuscripts secretly in drawers and thinking, really, I could do this so much better than the people that come in here. I never thought that. In fact, I thought you probably couldn't do it. Naturally, there was a great deal of respect and admiration for those people who did do it, so it was always deemed by me to be something worth doing. And what happened, and I'll do this in 5 seconds if I can, but the origin story on this is that my wife and I went on vacation in the Southwest, in New Mexico, and hiking, but like in sneakers, not serious hiking. Stuff that I can do. And we were in Santa Fe, which is about 40 miles from Los Alamos, and I'd always been interested in World War II, and I thought, we're so close, I'd like to see it. And we drove there and went up on the mesa, and I was absolutely fascinated by it, because it now looks like this Ozzie and Harriet dream town of the 1950s. It was the military buildings that were put up. But there's a little museum there. It sounds similar to Shanghai, isn't it? There I was in this museum looking at photographs thinking, what was that like? But their museum was all about the secrecy of the place. And I thought, now it looks like Ozzie and Harriet. But at one point, it was the most secret place on Earth. It did not technically exist. If you went to work on the Manhattan Project, you didn't go home for Thanksgiving. People wrote to some box number, not box office. And I thought, how extraordinary. What was that like? You couldn't leave the mesa except with special permission. I looked at things like driver's licenses, which were made out to numbers. The scientists were given different names. And I thought, it didn't technically exist. Nobody was allowed to visit it. And it was at that moment that, the little light bulb goes off over the head. And I thought, really, what would have happened if there'd been a crime? How would they go about solving it in a place that didn't actually exist or could not be admitted to exist? It was part of the secrecy and security that you were never to talk about it. I thought, what an interesting kind of conundrum. How would they work this out? You couldn't have cops up on the mesa. And I thought, what an intriguing idea. Who needs an idea? Who can I give it to? I was still in publishing thinking, who might be sparked by this? Because it sounded sort of cool to me. But there wasn't anybody, and you shouldn't do that, because it's only the writer's own ideas that are really going to pan out anyway. But it had got me hooked in the subject and thinking about it. And it turned out to be the summer of '95. So it was the 50th anniversary of Hiroshima. And there was a lot of stuff, op-ed stuff in the press, and most of it rightly focusing on the victimization and what this had meant to the world, etc. And I thought, but this is so interesting to read these pieces. They just seemed to me skewed in some way, that the impression was that these Dr. Strangeloves had gone off to the middle of the desert to plot the end of civilization as we knew it. And I thought, what we're talking about here is all the nuclear baggage that we bring to it. I was one of those children who had to duck under a desk during air raid drills. I'm sure some of you were too. That's the baggage we bring to it. But that is not necessarily how people felt if they were on the project in 1943 and 44. The average age of the scientists on the Manhattan Project was 27. Oppenheimer himself was just turning 40 and having a baby. These were young people. And I think, akin to the Silicon Valley of that time. And you then ask that empathetic question that always gets fiction going, I think, in my mind, is what if it had been you? What if you were this kid at USC and your eyes weren't good, so you weren't drafted, and the government came to you and said, we'd like you to work for the government. It's a secret place. You will not be released until this project is over. You won't go home. You can't talk about it. But here's what it is. You will be with the top 40 or 50 people in your field, and in those days there were only about 40 people. You will cross the threshold of science and unlock one of the kind of riddles of the universe, of how things are put together. You will make enormous scientific strides in your field, and you'll win the war for us. I would have said yes, and I would have been one of those people that was now the subject of these op-ed pieces, which I didn't disagree with, but I thought, this is a much more complicated thing. And it was at that point that it was no longer just the light bulb idea over the head. I thought, what happens when supposedly good people do supposedly the right thing and yet create these appalling legacies that we can't get rid of and that are going to change everything forever? And I thought, oh, that's a really interesting book. So in answer to your question about the publishing aspect, I did it secretly. It was my secret project because I thought, what if I can't do it? And what could be more humiliating than a publisher who can't write? And it's not a very generous business anyway. You know, I imagine going to parties where people would say, oh, I hear you're working on something. How's that coming? You know, and I thought, oh, I'd be so embarrassed if it really didn't work. So anyway, I did it secretly, and the rest of it became a Cinderella story because I did finish it and it did work, and I discovered that I loved doing it, which I didn't know before then. And because it worked, I was able to do more. So I went to the other side of the desk. But since that was 95, we're talking about I've now been a writer longer than I ever was a publisher, even though somehow the identity you establish when you're young is always with you. So sometimes I think I'm a publisher manqué until I get any of the high text aspect of it, and I realize that, you know, for me, it's almost like quills and pens compared, you know, it's a very different business.
I wanted to get back to this particular book and to know if there's any character that you particularly liked or related to that you wrote in the Shanghai book, and if so, why?
Okay. I'll answer that with an anecdote. On a different book, a very good friend of mine said, having read it, he said, well, congratulations, you finally managed to write a book in which there isn't a single sympathetic character. And I said, gee, that's funny. I love them all. I thought they were all so interesting and with a mix. In this particular book, my secret favorite is probably Uncle Nathan. And I think he perfectly exemplifies that quality that I'm talking about, that everybody's an unholy mix. This is a man who can be funny and affectionate and who's certainly on our protagonist's side, and wants, in a way, it's a story of succession as much as anything. But he is also a gangster. He has also been responsible for people's deaths. He's a participant in a brothel that's running young girls from the countries. This is beyond being a mixed bag. This is somebody who truly has the angel and the devil on either side of his shoulders. Consequently, if you're a writer, that's always fascinating to do, you know.
I think you've sort of answered this in an offhand way, but you write about characters in the past, 30s, 40s, 50s, early 60s. Will you ever be writing about characters in a more modern day setting?
You are not the first to ask this question.
Of course not.
You know, a lot of my books are set in the immediate post-war period, and then a few of them were during the Cold War. I mean, I think the most recent in terms of chronology was 1962, 63. My wife claims that if I just keep going, I will eventually write a contemporary novel, because but I'm drawn to that period. I think that you can make a lot of points that are about contemporary society while you're writing about a more historical one. There's somebody made a comparison that it's like being in a battle scene. If you're actually in the battle, you don't know what's going on. It's all very confusing and all very heady and all over the place. But what history can do is put us up on this hill that's looking down on the battle, and if we have enough accurate information, we can see what truly had happened or what was going on. I think it's one of the great appeals of history as a discipline, as a methodology, because how can you know if somebody said to me now, describe contemporary society, what would you say? I don't know that I have enough information to do that. At some point, we are going to have enough information. I could answer it, and it's not necessarily an answer anybody would want to hear. But I think that the further we are from a scene, an historical scene, the more we're able to put together what did happen. Now, the contrary argument to this is that all you're ever going to have are the broad strokes outlined because, A, people forget, people lie. A biographer once said to me, the thing you have to keep in mind when you're doing interviews is that nobody tells the truth because nobody remembers accurately. If I talk about a dinner party that happened 2 weeks ago and I ask 4 people who were there, you get 4 different versions of it. So history itself is a tainted thing that comes down to us, but nevertheless, I think if you're writing in period, if you're writing fiction in period, you are now much more informed and you can see it whole, whereas before you were seeing it from the inside. So it's tricky, but it's tricky to write in period. One of the issues, for instance, is what language do you use? And I have always found that it's much better to just be neutral in terms of using slang or things that would be considered timely. It's like, a great example would be, gee, I think you're swell. People actually may have said that at one point, but if you write that now in a book, it's like you're highlighting, oh, I'm doing period. It's really Mickey Rooney doing this. So anything else, or as they said in 48, have you had enough? Right?
Thank you so much, Joseph Kanon.
Pleasure.
You're fabulous. Okay.